If you're watching this right now, you're about to witness one of the most audacious and morally ambiguous tactical experiments of the Second World War, a story that walks the razor's edge between battlefield genius and war crime, where survival depended on silhouettes in the fog and the shape of a helmet could mean the difference between infiltration and annihilation. Before we dive into the shadows of the Vosges forests and the frozen crossroads of the Ardennes, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one, where history meets human desperation and tactical brilliance collide with the laws of war, don't get told often enough, and you won't want to miss what's coming next on this channel. December 1944, somewhere in the rolling, snow-dusted hills of eastern France, near the German border. The war had ground into its most brutal phase. After the breakneck dash across France following D-Day, the Allied advance had slowed to a bloody crawl. The Germans, now fighting on their own soil or close to it, defended every meter with a ferocity born of desperation. Fortified villages, bunkers left over from the Maginot Periphery, improvised strongpoints in farmhouses and crossroads, all manned by veterans who knew the ground and had nowhere left to retreat. For the American infantry divisions pushing east, progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, each one paid for in blood and steel. In one such division, a rifle company found itself tasked with clearing a series of small hamlets and road junctions that controlled access to a key supply route. The Germans had turned every stone barn and every tree line into a fortress. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Mortar observers had the ranges dialed in, and the dense fog that rolled in each dawn made artillery support a guessing game. Frontal assaults were suicide. Flanking maneuvers took time the division didn't have. Casualties mounted, and morale frayed like the wool blankets the men wrapped around themselves against the December cold. Lieutenant Joseph Harker commanded 2nd Platoon. Before the war, he'd been a high school history teacher in Pennsylvania, the kind of man who could explain Cannae and Austerlitz with chalk and passion. The Army had recognized something in him and made him an instructor at Fort Benning before shipping him overseas as a replacement officer in the autumn of '44. Harker wasn't West Point, wasn't regular Army, but he had a gift for seeing ground and reading men. More importantly, he had the kind of mind that asked uncomfortable questions. One night, huddled in a cellar that reeked of mildew and cordite, studying a captured map by the light of a shielded candle, he asked one out loud. "Why do our patrols keep getting spotted?" he said to Sergeant Bill Kowalski, his platoon sergeant. Kowalski, a Detroit machinist before the war, looked up from cleaning his garand. "Because the Krauts have good eyes, and we make noise," Kowalski said. "Not always," Harker said. "Last night, Baker section moved quiet as mice, used the draw like we planned, and still got lit up by a flare before they got within 100 yards of that barn. The sentry saw something." "Silhouette," said a voice from the corner. It belonged to Private First Class Emil Richter, the platoon's best scout and a second-generation German immigrant from Wisconsin. His family had anglicized the name from Richter to Rector in 1917, then changed it back after his father died. Emil spoke German at home, listened to his grandmother's stories of the old country, and now found himself using that knowledge to eavesdrop on enemy radio chatter and interrogate prisoners. He was thin, dark-eyed, and possessed an unnerving ability to move through terrain like smoke. "They see the silhouette," he continued. "American helmet, the M1. It's got that brim, that ridge, distinctive, different from a Stahlhelm. Even in the dark, even at 100 yards, your brain registers it. Stahlhelm's got that coal scuttle shape, flares out in back. You see that shape, you relax for half a second. You think it's one of yours." Harker stared at him. "You're saying we should wear German helmets?" "I'm saying," Emil replied carefully, "that if you're trying to get close in low light, and the sentry's tired and cold and sees a familiar silhouette moving where it's supposed to be moving, he might hesitate, might not hit the flare gun right away." Kowalski snorted. "That's a good way to get shot by our own guys, or court-martialed. Hague conventions say you can't fight in enemy uniform." "Not a full uniform," Emil said. "Just the helmet. Maybe a coat over your jacket. Enough to confuse the shape at distance, in fog or dark. And we'd have to mark ourselves, something our guys could see up close. Tape, armbands, something." Harker rubbed his face. He was exhausted, they all were, but the idea wormed into his brain. The Hague Conventions, yes, Article 23, perfidy, all that. But was a helmet a uniform? Was using captured equipment to deceive the enemy at night a ruse of war or a violation? The line was blurry. The British had used captured German vehicles in North Africa. Commandos wore enemy gear for raids. The Germans themselves, he'd heard rumors, had used American uniforms during the recent Bulge offensive in a thing called Operation Greif, Skorzeny's men, though that had been rare and controversial. This was different. Smaller scale, just helmets, just silhouettes. "We'd need helmets," Harker said slowly. "Enough for a squad." "We've got 4 in the supply dump," Kowalski said. "Taken off prisoners. Another 3 came in yesterday from a weapons cache we found." "We'd need procedure," Harker continued. "Signals, so our own people don't kill us, and we'd need to be damn sure about the legality. I'm not leading men into something that gets them shot as spies." The next day, Harker went up the chain. He spoke to the company commander, Captain Allen, a gruff man from Georgia, who had survived Normandy and saw the war as a problem to be solved with maximum violence and minimum casualties. Allen listened, frowned, and said he'd check with battalion. Battalion said they'd check with regiment. 2 days later, the answer came back. Permissible as a ruse de guerre provided no full uniforms were worn, provided the deception was not used to kill under false pretenses during a surrender or parley, and provided strict protocols were in place to prevent friendly fire. It was a grey area, and higher-ups were willing to look the other way if it saved American lives. But it was on Harker. If it went south, it was his neck. Harker assembled a squad. 8 men, including Emil Richter and Corporal Danny Ortega, a soft-spoken Texan who'd been an apprentice carpenter and now served as the platoon's demolitions expert. Ortega had a gift for patience and precision, the kind of man who could set a charge with shaking hands and still get the placement perfect. They gathered in a blacked-out barn behind the lines. Harker laid out the plan. They would use German helmets, captured greatcoats if available, and minimal other gear. They would move at dusk or dawn, when light was poorest and sentries were groggiest. They would carry no identification that could link them to their units if captured, just dog tags. They would wear 2-inch wide strips of white medical tape around their left arms, visible only up close. They would use simple hand signals and pre-arranged challenge response codes in English to identify themselves to friendly forces. If they encountered Germans at close range, Emil would speak German, claim to be from a relief unit, and try to pass long enough to get into position. Once weapons were drawn, the deception ended. No killing under false colors. And if challenged by Americans, they would immediately shout Yellowstone, the week's recognition code, and freeze. The first test came 3 nights later. The target was a machine gun nest covering a road junction, dug into the back of a stone shed. Reconnaissance had spotted 2 sentries, rotating every 2 hours. The nest itself was invisible from the front, but the approach was open ground, 100 yards of frozen mud and stubble. Previous attempts had been spotted and driven back by fire. Harker chose 4 men, Emil Ortega, and 2 riflemen, Perkins and Shaw. They blacked their faces with burnt cork, donned the Stahlhelm helmets, and wrapped themselves in captured German greatcoats, heavy field-grey wool that smelled of tobacco and old sweat. Underneath, they wore their American uniforms and gear. The white tape went on their left arms. They carried Thompson submachine guns, grenades, and a satchel charge for the nest. They moved out at 05:30, half an hour before dawn, when the world was a study in greys and the fog clung to the ground like a living thing. They crossed the field in a loose file, moving slowly, hunched, using a shallow irrigation ditch for cover. The cold bit through their clothes and their breath plumed in the air. Emil led, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. At 75 yards, they saw the shed, a black shape against the slightly less black sky. At 50 yards, a figure moved near the corner. A sentry stamping his feet, carbine slung over his shoulder. Emil froze. The others froze behind him. They waited. The sentry turned, looked in their direction, and then turned back. He'd seen them, or seen movement, but the silhouette, the coal scuttle helmets, the slow, tired shuffle, all of it registered as familiar. His brain said, "Ours." He did nothing. Emil moved again, slower now, angling toward a low stone wall that ran near the shed. The others followed, breath held, hearts hammering. They reached the wall. Ortega slipped forward with the satchel charge, a canvas bag packed with composition C2 and a short fuse. The sentry was 20 feet away, now facing away, talking in low tones to someone inside the shed. Emil heard the German clear as day. "Wann kommt die Ablösung?" "When's the relief coming?" And the reply from inside, "Eine Stunde vielleicht." "An hour, maybe." Ortega planted the charge against the base of the wall near the machine gun's firing slit, set the fuse for 30 seconds, and pulled the igniter. He moved back, fast and low. Emil hissed, Zurück jetzt! Back, now, in German, his voice urgent but not alarmed. The sentry half-turned, saw the helmeted figures retreating, and for a moment, confusion clouded his face. Then the charge blew. The explosion was a dull crump, muffled by the stone and earth, but the effect was immediate. The wall buckled, the machine gun inside was obliterated, and the sentry was thrown forward by the concussion. Perkins and Shaw opened fire with their Thompsons, short, controlled bursts, catching the sentry and a second man who stumbled out of the shed, deafened and bleeding. It was over in seconds. The nest was neutralized. No American casualties. They fell back through the lifting fog, shed the German gear in a covered position, and made it back to friendly lines just as full dawn broke. The white tape on their arms was the only thing that stopped a nervous machine gunner from cutting them down. They shouted Yellowstone 3 times before anyone recognized them. In the debrief, Harker noted the success, but also the dangers. The near shooting by their own side, the moral weight of the deception, the fact that they had killed men who, for a few seconds, thought they were looking at comrades. It sat heavy, but the nest was gone, and the road was open. Word spread fast. Battalion wanted more. Harker's platoon was pulled back for a week, given more captured gear, more helmets, and a list of targets. 17 fortified positions spread across a 20-mile front, each one a thorn in the division's side. The plan was refined. Signals were codified. Each team would carry a red-filtered flashlight for signaling other American units. Challenge codes were changed daily. Emil worked with intelligence to gather German passwords and countersigns, listening to radio intercepts and questioning prisoners. They learned that German sentries used timed challenges, phrases like, "Woher kommst du?" "Where are you from?" with responses that changed weekly, "Aus Bayern," "From Bavaria," or "Von der vierten Kompanie," "From the 4th Company." Emil memorized them, practiced the accent, the cadence. The method evolved. Teams moved in pairs, one team approaching while the other provided overwatch and covering fire if needed. They used the terrain, every depression and shadow, every tree line and wall. They learned to read the wind, to move when it gusted and masked their noise. They learned the smell of the battlefield, cordite and diesel and latrine pits, and used it to orient themselves in the dark. They learned to listen to the clank of a mess kit, the scrape of a boot, the cough of a cold sentry. They learned to be patient, to wait for the sentry to look away, to time their movements with the passage of a cloud across the moon. Over the next 6 weeks, they hit 19 more targets. A mortar pit behind a farmhouse, taken by creeping up during a shift change and tossing grenades into the pit before the crew could react. A fortified cellar beneath a burned-out church, cleared by Ortega's satchel charge and a follow-up assault by regular infantry. A sniper hide in a ruined mill, neutralized when Emil and Shaw approached in German coats, called out a password, and shot the sniper when he stood to greet what he thought were replacements. A roadblock at a crossroads, 3 men with a machine gun and a Panzerschreck, killed in their sleep when Harker's team cut through a wire fence and came in from behind, moving so quietly that the sentries never woke. A railroad depot, a stone farmhouse, a concrete pillbox with firing slits, a bunker complex with interconnected trenches, all taken by variations of the same method: deception, surprise, violence, and withdrawal. The Germans began to adapt. Passwords changed more frequently, sometimes daily. Sentries started working in pairs, one always facing the rear. Flares were used more liberally, turning night into harsh white day at random intervals. Booby traps appeared on approaches, tripwires strung across likely infiltration routes. The counterintelligence officer at regiment warned that the enemy was aware something was happening, that sentries were being told to shoot first and ask questions later if they saw anything suspicious. The window was closing. The cost began to mount as well. On the 14th operation, a team led by Sergeant Kowalski was caught in a flare's light 50 yards from a casamata. The sentry saw the Stahlhelms, but also saw the Thompsons, saw the way they moved and opened fire. Kowalski took a round through the shoulder. The team fought their way out, killed 2 Germans, and dragged Kowalski back, but he was out of the war, evacuated to a field hospital and then stateside. Harker felt the weight of it. The man had been his right hand. Worse came on the 17th operation. A team was returning from a successful hit on a supply cache when they were challenged by an American patrol near the front line. In the darkness and confusion, the patrol saw the German helmets and opened fire before the team could shout the code. Private Shaw was killed instantly, shot through the head. Perkins was wounded in the leg. The patrol, realizing their mistake only when they saw the white armbands in the flashlight's beam, was devastated. The platoon was shaken. Harker called a meeting. They discussed whether to continue. Some men wanted to stop, said the risk was too high, said they were pushing their luck. Others, including Emil, argued that they'd come too far, that the enemy was on edge but not yet fully wise to the tactic, and that stopping now would waste Shaw's death. Harker made the call. They would continue, but with stricter rules. No movement within 500 yards of friendly lines without prior coordination with adjacent units. All teams would carry a recognition panel, a bright orange cloth to be displayed if challenged by friendly forces, and they would attempt only 3 more operations, the hardest targets, the ones that mattered most. The 18th target was a fortified manor house on a hill overlooking a valley, used as a company headquarters and observation post. It was surrounded by wire, mines, and interlocking fields of fire. Battalion had lost a platoon trying to take it 2 weeks earlier. Harker studied the maps, walked the ground in daylight from a distant hillside through binoculars, and planned the approach. They would go in at dawn, not dusk, using the morning fog that rose from the river in the valley. They would split into 2 teams, one to create a diversion at the front gate, drawing fire and attention, while the other, led by Emil, would slip in from the rear through a garden that overlooked a cliff face. The cliff was steep, almost vertical, which is why the Germans had left it unguarded except for a single sentry at the top. The operation launched on a freezing January morning, the kind where the cold burned in your lungs. Harker's diversion team moved up the road, making just enough noise pretending to be a supply detail. They wore the helmets, called out in German, and when the gate sentry challenged them, Harker, coached by Emil, responded with the day's password, Königstiger, King Tiger. The sentry hesitated, opened the gate a crack, and Harker's team rushed him, overpowering him in seconds and silencing him with a knife. They planted charges on the gate and waited. Meanwhile, Emil's team scaled the cliff. Ortega went first, climbing with a rope and grapnel, finding hand and footholds in the frozen rock. It took 20 minutes, each second an eternity. At the top he secured the rope. Emil climbed next, then 2 riflemen. They reached the garden, covered in snow, and moved toward the manor's rear entrance. The sentry was inside a small guardhouse, visible through a window, smoking a cigarette and stamping his feet. Emil approached the door, knocked, and called out, "Ablösung here," relief here. The sentry opened the door, saw the Stahlhelm, saw the greatcoat, and for a moment his face relaxed. Then he saw Emil's eyes, saw the Thompson, and tried to shout. Emil shot him once, the suppressor muffling the sound to a sharp cough. They were inside. The manor was chaos. Harker's charges at the front gate blew, the explosion shaking the building. Germans poured out of rooms, grabbing weapons, shouting orders. Emil's team moved through the ground floor, clearing rooms with grenades and gunfire. They reached the operations room, where maps and radios were set up. Ortega placed a satchel charge and they fell back. The manor erupted in flames as the charge detonated, destroying the headquarters. The surviving Germans fled into the valley, and American forces moved up to occupy the hill. The operation was a success, but Emil and Ortega both carried wounds, shrapnel from a grenade that had been tossed into a hallway. They were patched up and sent back. The 19th operation was almost routine, hitting a fuel dump guarded by 4 men. It went smoothly, too smoothly. Harker felt the unease. They were being watched. Intelligence reported that the Germans had issued orders to check uniforms and helmets carefully, to demand recognition codes even from familiar faces, and to shoot anyone who refused to comply. The enemy had adapted. The window had closed. The 20th and final operation was thrust upon them by circumstances. In early February, during the dying days of winter, a German counterattack threatened to cut off an American regiment. The key to the counterattack was a crossroads fortified with bunkers, machine guns, and a pair of anti-tank guns. If the crossroads fell, the regiment could be supplied and reinforced. If it held, they would be surrounded. Division ordered Harker's platoon to take the crossroads, using whatever methods they had. It was a suicide mission disguised as an opportunity. Harker gathered his remaining men. They were down to 15 effectives, the rest rotated out, wounded or dead. He laid out the plan. They would hit the crossroads at dusk, full platoon assault. But the initial approach would be made by a single team, Emil and Ortega and 2 others, using the German gear one last time. They would try to talk their way into the position, claiming to be a relief unit, and open the defenses from the inside. Once the shooting started, The rest of the platoon would attack from two sides, supported by mortar fire and a tank platoon held in reserve. The team moved out as the sun bled red on the horizon. They wore the Stahlhelms, the greatcoats, and carried their weapons slung casually, moving down the road toward the crossroads like tired soldiers trudging to a new post. The crossroads loomed ahead, a cluster of sandbagged bunkers and trenches, with the barrels of machine guns protruding like black fingers. A sentry stepped out, carbine raised. "Halt! Wer da? Halt, who's there?" Emil responded, his German flawless, his tone weary. "Verstärkung, 7. Kompanie. Reinforcements, 7th Company." The sentry frowned. "Kennwort? Password." Emil's heart hammered. They didn't have it. The passwords had changed that morning. He took a gamble. "Wir sind seit 2 Tagen unterwegs. Niemand hat uns informiert." "We've been on the road for 2 days, nobody informed us." The sentry hesitated, unsure, and called back to someone in the trench. "Hier sind Leute. Sagen Sie sind von der 7. "There are people here, say they're from the 7th. A voice shouted back. "Bring sie her, aber vorsichtig. Bring them over, but carefully." Emil and the others moved forward slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. They reached the trench. 4 Germans stood there, weapons lowered but ready. One, an unteroffizier with a scarred face, looked them over. He saw the Stahlhelms, the coats, but something was off. Maybe the boots, American issue, or the way Ortega held his Thompson too casually, or the faint smell of unfamiliar cigarette tobacco. His eyes narrowed. "Zeig mir deine Papiere. Show me your papers." Emil didn't have papers. He moved fast, pulling his Thompson up, shouting, "Now!" in English. Ortega fired first, a burst that cut down the unteroffizier. The other Germans scrambled, returning fire. Emil shot one, missed another. Grenades flew. The trench became an inferno of noise and smoke. Behind them, Harker's platoon charged. Mortar rounds walked across the crossroads, exploding in geysers of frozen earth. The tank platoon rolled up, their 75mm guns hammering the bunkers. Emil's team was pinned in the trench, trading fire with Germans in the adjacent bunker. Ortega crawled forward, planted a satchel charge against the bunker's rear wall and detonated it. The bunker collapsed, flames and debris erupting skyward. The machine gun fell silent. The battle lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the crossroads was in American hands, but the cost was brutal. Emil took a round through the chest, collapsing in the trench as Harker's men swept through. Ortega was hit in the arm and face by fragments. Of the initial 4-man team, 2 were dead, 2 were wounded. The platoon as a whole lost 5 men killed and 11 wounded. The regiment was saved, the counterattack blunted, but the price was written in blood and screaming. Emil survived, barely. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England, and finally to the States. He spent 6 months in recovery, a sucking chest wound that should have killed him, but didn't. Ortega lost part of his jaw and most of his hearing in one ear, but lived. Harker stayed with the platoon through the end of the war, saw Germany surrender, and came home to Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1945. He never taught history again, instead worked in a hardware store, rarely speaking of the war. When he did, he avoided talking about the operations, the helmets, the infiltrations. It was too complicated, too grey. The official record noted that Harker's platoon had successfully conducted 20 raids on enemy fortifications over 2 months, neutralizing key positions and facilitating the advance. No mention was made of the methods used, the captured equipment, the deception. That was quietly scrubbed, classified, buried in after-action reports that never saw publication. The legality, the ethics, all of it remained unresolved. Harker received a Silver Star. Emil and Ortega received Bronze Stars with Valor devices, and the dead received Purple Hearts and headstones. Years later, a historian researching unconventional tactics in the European theater came across a cryptic reference in a division report, a single line about captured equipment utilized for close reconnaissance, and tried to dig deeper. He interviewed Harker in 1972, old and grey and tired. Harker confirmed the broad strokes but refused to provide details, saying only, "We did what we had to do. Some things worked. Some things cost too much. I don't know if it was worth it. We lived, the enemy died, the war ended. That's all." Emil, back in Wisconsin, married his high school sweetheart and ran a small farm. He rarely spoke German again, the language now tangled with memories of dark fields and shouted challenges and the face of the unteroffizier he shot at point-blank range. When his grandson asked him about the war decades later, he said only, I learned that a helmet is just a piece of metal, but in the dark, it's a lie that can keep you alive or get you killed, and sometimes you don't know which until it's too late. Ortega returned to Texas, worked construction and drank too much. The nightmares never stopped, the sound of the satchel charge detonating, the feel of shrapnel tearing through his face, the smell of burning flesh. He told his priest once in confession that he believed he had sinned by wearing the enemy's helmet, by deceiving men before killing them, even if the army said it was legal. The priest absolved him, but Ortega didn't